Hello and welcome to the Future of Dogs podcast, a place for the whole dog world to come together and ask the big why and what if questions that will shape the dogs of the future. Join me, Hannah Malloy, dog behaviourist and body language expert, as we chat to some of the world's most groundbreaking professionals intent on enriching and evolving the future for dogs. This series is sponsored by Amplified Behaviour, my online video school where you can find quality dog behaviour and training advice at a fraction of the price, because I believe everyone should be able to afford the knowledge that they need to give their dogs the best life possible. Let's jump in to the next episode. Are you sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin. Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Future of Dogs. And this episode is titled The Future of Dog Ownership Part 1, Dog Licenses. And if you have tracked through our past episodes or followed me on social media, you might know already that I'm particularly interested in this topic. When we finished our Dog Bite Problem 3-part education event in Parliament in 2023, licensing of dogs was a highly recommended solution in the polls. And when the UK was thrown into a debate about whether to ban the XL bully, I and many other experts were plastered repeatedly all over national radio and TV at the first report of any bite or tragic fatality. And my answer to reducing dog bites on every panel and platform was consistently to implement a dog license and education system. Now, we know John Tulloch caught up with me on YouTube at the start of lockdown to explain that dog bites had actually tripled in the last 20 years. And dog bites at that point were costing us £777 million per year, a figure that has recently been extrapolated at a cost of about £1 billion a year for all of the fallout of out-of-control dogs. But we can't make policy decisions without robust evidence. Although sadly, in the case of managing dog behaviour, we certainly have in the past. But this is why we're passionate about the future of dogs, because the future should always be built on lessons of the past. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to a lady that has been gathering a great deal of very important evidence on behalf of the RSPCA and has published a seminal and very timely report that I know the eyes of policymakers all over the world are going to want to read. Oh my goodness, let me introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Mayher. Dr. Jennifer Mayher is an associate professor in green criminology at the University of South Wales, and she specialises in researching environmental crime, human animal studies, and interpersonal youth violence and victimisation. She has published widely on animal abuse, dangerous dogs, illegal pet trades, and wildlife crime, and has attracted funding for her research from the UNODC, the European Commission, European Parliament, Scottish, Welsh, and UK governments, the South Wales Police, and even key NGOs like the RSPCA in this case. Her expertise is sought nationally and internationally, including completing the UN ICCWC Toolkit review of the UK's response to wildlife and forest crime, the Welsh Government Theory of Change evaluation of wildlife and rural crime coordination programme, and the Scottish Government scoping of the UK illegal puppy trade. Oh my gosh, we get such amazing guests on this show. Jennifer, I've been so looking forward to talking to you, and thank you for conducting this crucial piece of work. This is contrasting and comparing different dog control strategies across the world. You're going to explain it a lot better than I will, and I can't wait for you to tell us more about it. But welcome to the show.
Hi, Hannah. It's lovely to be here. And it is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? That introduction.
It just gets me warmed up. I think most people's bios, they just allow my mouth to move all the way around, and occasionally we stumble, but that's fine. But what an incredible career you've had. Absolutely outstanding work you've already done, Jennifer. And I wonder, before we dive into your works, could you tell us, we love our scientists, don't we, to be as unbiased as possible, of course, but are you a dog fan, Jennifer? What's your background with dogs?
So who's not a dog fan? How can you not be a dog fan? I've grown up with dogs, so I've always had dogs in my life. And as soon as I was able, I rescued a dog, and have had dogs pretty much my whole adult life. And when I was able, so after moving from a student at a rented property into something more stable, I started to foster dogs for a local rescue. For about 15 years, I've had over 200 rescue dogs in my life.
Wow.
And that obviously has been an extremely an amazing experience. I've had so many wonderful dogs in my life, but also it's provided a balance for the research that I do in relation to animal abuse and harms and linked to interpersonal violence. So, and of course, dogs always provide us lots of learning experiences, don't they? So that's certainly been my case in my personal life.
It's true. They are the best teachers, we always say, don't we, as trainers and owners. Like, you'll learn so much more from your dog. And 200 teachers is quite a lot of teachers. So that's amazing, Jenny. You must have had some really incredible relationships there. I'd love to get into that in more detail. But I wonder if you can answer the question that all of our guests get the opportunity to bring, which is, what is your what if question that could shape the dogs of the future?
I think, I have plenty of what if questions when it comes to shaping the future for our dogs. And because I've looked at various aspects from what people in the past call status dogs to dangerous dogs to the legal puppy trade and so on and so forth. So I've lots of different things that I think really influence and will impact the dogs of the future. But in terms of what we're talking about today, I think my what if question is, what if we truly sought to find a balance between the needs and the wants of dogs and people, dog owners and the rest of the community? So what if we were able to shift our approach to encouraging a culture of care, of engagement and responsible dog ownership for all of society? So not just dogs and their owners, but for everybody who is engaging with them, whether they care to or not. And what would that look like? How would we be as dog owners? How would we be as people in the community who have to engage with them? And what would we want from and for our dogs?
Amazing. That's amazing. And you've done a lot of work in this area. That bio doesn't really touch on it. And the report, just to give you guys a heads up that I'm holding it right now. If you're watching this on YouTube, I love paper and I love highlighter pens and I love research. And this is so delicious. Look at all this delicious data that exists in this report. So for me, Jennifer, as I say, a big fan of your work. Like, I have been waiting for this for a long time, and I know many policymakers have been too. And have you had much interest in it since it's come out, or is it like slowly starting to filter out? Have you found?
Along the way. So I think most important thing to say is this report was funded by the RSPCA, and I've worked very closely with Sam Gaines in relation to developing the research and then publishing the report. And of course, then they've developed their own report from research. So it's a bit more digestible. Maybe that's the one you should have held up for people to see. And along the way...
We love the detail, Jenny. We love the detail. Just to give you a heads up, guys, because I haven't named it yet and we really should. The name of this report is Preventing Dog Bites in the UK, Evidencing Alternative Approaches to Responsible Dog Ownership. And this was published by Associate Professor Jennifer Mayher in 2024. So you can find that link really easily online. But as Jennifer says, the RSPCA have done a sort of a simpler version that's called their Take the Lead report, that we're really looking forward to them coming to present with us a little bit later in the year, hopefully. But yes, tell us, keep going, Jennifer. I interrupted you.
No, it's fine. You were asking about interest, and along the way. So as we have been moving from one stage to the next of this research, we've tried to engage the various government officials who have an interest in this area to make sure that they're as up to date as possible of what's happening with regard to our kind of research, which was kind of reviewing what kind of we currently know, or at least think we know, about why dog bites, for example, happen. And then what are the kind of responses that we can put in place to those? What are other places, other countries, other areas doing in regards to trying to have responsible dog ownership in their communities? And then looking at the kind of key case studies that we identified and what we can learn from those. What are our takeaway messages that may be helpful for us here in the UK? So I think the important thing is you can't just look at an approach that's taken elsewhere and say, yes, that's perfect. Let's put that in place here in the UK, because there are cultural differences, demographic differences. There's a lot of things to take into consideration, and especially when you're talking about responsible dog ownership and the potential to prevent dog bites. That's well, as you've had many speakers in here that are well more informed than I am with regard to these issues, but essentially, they're very complicated and complex interactions that we have between ourselves and dogs, and as a result, it's not something that can be easily fixed or something that we just look elsewhere and adopt that for ourselves. So we have to look at the approaches that will offer us some tools that we can then employ. So I think the best approach is to take various tools, put them in place, and then see what works in those situations. And that's the kind of messaging that we've been trying to send out to those who are interested in the report, that there's potential here for us to adopt a lot of this, but tailor it to our own circumstances and situations and needs.
And what would you say? So just to give everybody a little bit more detail, you were looking at a great number of different countries' ways of dealing with dogs, isn't it? So we were really, I think there were 45, weren't there? 45 countries, and 35 of those had some sort of dog control legislation. But then you were focusing down on a number that had some key areas of dog legislation. Just tell us what your sample was that we were looking at there, Jenny, so that people can get a feel for what the report looks at.
So we had, so in addition to looking at the scoping kind of literature review, we then conducted a systematic review of 45 countries, looking specifically at their dog control legislation. So what is it that they have in place with regard to kind of restrictions, bans, or other requirements for dog ownership? And out of those, we were able to find the legislation or the policy that was in place for 35 countries. Now, I talk about 35 countries, but in reality, most of these countries don't have a single policy or a single approach. They might have a kind of universal policy, but then it can be applied in different ways depending on the structure of the government in that particular country. So we had, I think it was, if I remember correctly, something like 111 different, if you like, locations within those 45 countries that we look to review.
Yeah, amazing, which is a huge number, actually, of different local populations of humans that are sort of working out how they're going to do dog control their way. And when you were looking into that, that's a massive body of data, and probably frustrating then to say, actually, we can't say how, for example, Germany deals with dog control, because each of the different areas of Germany deal with it differently. Am I right? So how would you find that works in terms of like a strategy? Do you find that countries, having looked at the research, having looked at the data, if a country has a countrywide approach, have you found that that's better than a national approach, or vice versa?
It is difficult to say, because when I say we kind of reviewed these countries, and then we attempted to kind of evaluate what they're doing. And the problem is evaluation is very problematic, because often we don't have the data that we need to conduct those evaluations. So for the purpose of the scoping of what countries are currently doing, that was simply looking at what is the kind of legislation saying, what kind of approaches are they taking in these locations. As to how effective they are, that's a different question altogether.
Yeah.
So we were able to kind of to focus a bit more down on 5 case studies, and then particularly focused on one that we thought seemed to address the kind of key focus of what we're trying to achieve, which was to look at effective and sustainable kind of responsible dog ownership, which also very much takes into consideration the welfare of the dogs. And these were kind of key words that we were most interested in terms of, if you think of effective, as I said, this is something that is very difficult to evaluate or to prove, because where policies are put in place or where strategies or approaches are put in place, often they don't come with an evaluation. So often we don't know if it works or not. The data that might help us to identify if it works or not, such as, for example, dog bite data, or the number of registered or licensed dogs, or the number of dogs that are roaming and then brought back to their owners. That kind of data is not available easily in most of these locations. And then if you think about sustainable, you want to have an approach that could be adopted in the UK in a sustainable way. So something that is, if you like, kind of reasonable and tailored to the kind of culture, to the population of dogs, to the financial resources that are available to respond to these sort of issues in society. And also that's something that is compatible with the needs of the population. So if there isn't buy-in from people, then essentially it makes it non-sustainable. And then obviously welfare. As you've already pointed out, many of your guest speakers in previous podcasts, when we think about our approach to responsible dog ownership, or if you like, regulating dogs, it really does seem to ignore a lot of the best practice and our understanding of what is good dog welfare. And I don't think we have to go far beyond the dangerous dogs legislation and the banning of certain breeds, for example, to point that out and how that works in practice in terms of what they experience, what their owners experience, and the length of time it can take for these sort of cases to come to the fore. Mm. So there's lots there in terms of what we were trying to identify in kind of out of the various case studies we looked at. And as I said, there was one case study, Calgary, that seemed to kind of meet those that criteria that we'd set out to find. But going back to your question about what works best, I think I'm convinced that a tailored response is a better approach than a blanket one. And the reason for that is that, again, I know you've talked to Carrie Westgate and to John Tulloch, and their data tells us that different instances of dog bites are happening in different parts of the country. Mm. There are different socioeconomic, even when we look at Calgary, geographic features and factors that will influence these sort of issues. So it makes sense then to think about how specific areas, specific regions, or specific populations may need a different approach to what's happening. So what you might find is in a country, they might have a general approach, and then they allow their kind of different localities to put something specific in place. So in terms of Canada, they would have general restrictions or requirements for dogs, but then Calgary, which is where we did the case study, they have their own bylaw that specifically details what their requirements and their restrictions or regulations are with regard to dogs. So that approach absolutely seems to, well, from the evidence I've seen, seems to work better than a blanket approach.
Interesting. That is really interesting. And I wonder the complexities there with communicating that. You know, for example, I grew up in Birmingham. In Birmingham, there is a law that's like, you do not walk your dog on a road without a lead. Like, that's just a law. If you're walking on a main road or any road, if there's cars on it, then you should have your dog on a lead. And yet then you go to other parts of the country and you're like, oh my gosh, that dog is off lead. But actually in this area of the country, that's absolutely fine for someone to walk their dog if it's under control off a lead next to a road. So, and I've always found that really fascinating, that difference in those bylaws. And then the communication of that, I think, because from what I see as a trainer and behaviourist, a lot of the friction comes between communities, working out what is the rules, you know, and then sort of self-policing a lot of the time, some of those rules, which can have varied consequences and effects, I think, and start to fracture community. So fascinating, actually, that tailored, localised approach is actually seen to be evidenced and better. I love what you just said there about actually the measure of success is complicated, isn't it? I know one of the big criticisms that was brought to my table recently about licensing as a model for dog control is that if we look at, for example, Switzerland, I know Switzerland put together a licensing model, and they had a mandatory training course, and that was in 2008. And then I think it was in 2016 that they revoked it because 20% of dog owners didn't go to the course. And so their argument was that actually, it doesn't take very many for if what we're measuring success as is dog bite reduction, that if 20% aren't actually engaging with it, then dog bites can still be right up there. I think the difficulty from our perspective, though, from the UK's perspective, is that we don't even have a dog bite data collection form. So even if we were going to measure that right now, we would struggle
absolutely.
because the systems that we need in place to collect that data don't exist, right? So from what you have seen, Jenny, and I would love to get into sort of like the causal factors a little bit more here for those that are really entering this conversation fresh and don't know as much about dog bites and dog bite prevention as you or I. May I just quote some of your research?
Go for it, yes, please.
So it says in the intro, there are lots of causal factors. Both human and dog behavior contribute to bites, obviously, don't they? Situational, environmental, genetic, and developmental factors. Okay, so that for the layperson means, the environment, the context, the genetics of the animal, the development of the animal, and what it's been through in its early learning, and the relationship that it's had with the human there. And then you write, for example, young males at home or known to the dog were the most common victims. Unneutered, small, and male dogs were more likely to bite. Incidents mainly occurred during an interaction with the dog and suggested limited understanding of the dog's needs and a lack of appropriate dog socialization. The lower socioeconomic status of victims and warmer seasons were also noted in some studies. Breed was not identified in the literature as a key variable in the cause of dog bites. Which is a mic drop moment for me, I think, and many others, Jenny. Like, if that is true, how have we got ourselves to the stage where there are so many breed bans? It just seems bonkers if that's what the research is saying.
Well, that could be a podcast on its own.
Right.
So there is, I think, one study that people tend to quote, which suggests that breed is relevant in this conversation. But every other study basically says that all these other factors are the things that we need to be focusing on. One of the things in my report, which I found particularly interesting, kind of putting together, was the different breeds that are banned or restricted. And every time I talk to people like this, like, just look at the variation. Look at some list 15, some list 4, some list, and the lists are so variant in terms of, yes, there are some consistent breeds on there that you would expect. We know pit bulls, for example, are on there, other kind of bully breeds, but they vary so significantly that you think, well, what is the reasoning behind this? Why would you choose these breeds over the other breeds? Who's right? Where's the evidence to suggest that these are the ones you should be focusing on? Why are certain countries focused on these if no one agrees that these tend to be the difficult breeds or the more dangerous breeds? So I think the inconsistency tells us a lot about the evidence, and that is that there is very little evidence to suggest that any particular breed of dog is going to be the most dangerous breed, and therefore the one that is going to bite people more frequently. Mm-hmm. We know from data that there's lots of issues around identifying breeds to begin with. So even if we were to follow the data, we don't even have that information at our fingertips. And then if you think about the circumstances, where do we record the circumstances that lead to a bite? We don't. So, when I talk about Calgary, I'll talk about, kind of some people are doing this. And they're looking to do it better. But at least in terms of what we do, we don't have that information. So we're relying on people to identify the dog. We're relying on people in very, very extremely stressful and difficult circumstances to remember what happened, to notice what happened beforehand, all these things.
Yep.
If we don't have that information, we can't possibly be pointing fingers or saying that we know what's happening and therefore we have, kind of we know which dogs are responsible and why they're responsible. It's so complicated. And we just don't have the data. We don't have the information. We don't have the evidence to suggest that any particular breed is responsible for this. What we do have is evidence to suggest that there are certain situations that are more likely to result in a dog bite or strike happening. And they aren't consistent with this idea of a particular breed being responsible or more likely to be responsible for these incidents.
It's crazy. And so actually one of those, and that was the same thing that we found, Jenny, when we did the 3-part event in Parliament, with all of these amazing experts, and we say, tell us what the data says. And everybody came back and went, we can't trust the data. We haven't got the data. And so frustrating to even start that conversation of the data's really dodgy. It's collected differently in different places. Different councils collect dog bite data in very different ways. There's no mandate that you have to even report it unless it's definitely bitten a child. And even then, the dog bite data we have is hospitalization data. It's not, the little mini nips and niggles and things that happen before somebody gets to the stage where they're hospitalized. So really that first stage, then you might say that one of those first solutions is that we need better data collection systems. Am I right, Jenny? Did that come from the research?
Absolutely. And to I suppose, make things even more complicated in a way, perhaps, we shouldn't just be looking at dog bites, in terms of, is that the most important thing? Or should we be looking at, there's dog on dog, for example, incidents. There's other types of irresponsible behaviour that may be kind of a flag that something more serious can happen down the road. So, of course, we're restricted. We can only collect a certain amount of data, and we must collect the most significant and important. But at the same time, what else should we be looking at in terms of trying to get a clearer picture of what's happening? So, for example, in Calgary, where they don't just record bites, they'll record their other incidents. So they have a clearer picture of what's happening in their communities, what kind of dogs are responsible for different types of activities or incidents, if you like. And I think altogether that gives us a much better ability to put a response in place. Because if we don't have this data, we continue to drive forward responses that we've taken from the past. And you said about, you mentioned about the breed restrictions, and it's it seems like lots of countries have taken this on because other countries have done it rather than because they've carried out their own evidence review of what's happening there. So, the responses we're put in place, of course, they're not, if you like, fit for purpose, because we haven't got the evidence to support what a good response would look like. Although, of course, people like yourself and lots of my colleagues who do research in this area, they're putting together that information. But it's hard work because there's lots of gaps. And so it's definitely an area that needs a lot more research and focus for us to then be able to very, I suppose, clearly say, these are the issues, these are effective responses, and therefore this is the kind of approach we can put in place to make our community safer for all.
And so important, just to reiterate that figure that John Tillett gave us, an epidemiologist and very wise man, that it was costing, just dog bites were costing the UK £777 million a year. And that was extrapolated to about 1 billion when we were looking at all types of irresponsible dog ownership. So, out of control dogs and us not caring for and stewarding dogs well is already costing us £1 billion a year. We have the finance there to fix this because we're already spending it. And that's super important to reiterate, isn't it? It is an issue that is worth looking at and really worth investing some time and energy in, because it's costing us, and not just money, the fallout for dogs who have bitten humans, both on the dogs and on the humans, it's endless, isn't it, Jenny? Can you tell us a little bit about what we see from, the effects of dog bites on a population?
So, that we didn't specifically look at that. So that kind of taken us down a different route, if you like. But clearly there's psychological impact from people, not just who've been victims themselves, but the people around them. These incidents can be very traumatic, even if there isn't significant injury, just the kind of that interaction can be very, very impactful. It can obviously really scare communities. So in carrying out my research with regard to the use and abuse of dogs by young people, youth groups and gangs, in speaking with people in communities, they're terrified to use local parks, for example. And I'm pointing to this research because that's what my research was focusing on. But irresponsible dog ownership is not just within the kind of remit of the young people out there. Very much adults are equally as capable, if not more capable, of being irresponsible owners.
Absolutely.
But in terms of the research that I conducted, you can see the impact on communities not willing to use spaces because they didn't feel safe in them. People who fear for their own dog safety, who are going out late at night or early morning and not really engaging in their dog, or not allowing their dog to engage in natural behaviours because they're so fearful of these incidents happening to themselves and their dogs. Because we know one of the trigger points with dog bites is where dogs might get into a fight and a human goes in to kind of deal with that issue, and they get bitten in the process.
Yeah.
So the list goes on, Hannah, I feel like, in terms of the different ways in which people are impacted by a dog bite incident or a dog strike incident. We've heard in the past about postal workers, about people who use assistance dogs, and obviously increasingly people are using therapy dogs, and they have a huge impact on their lives. And again, if one of these incidents happens, we can't, if you like, measure the kind of impact that's going to have across a whole load of individuals and communities. So yeah, it's extensive, and we haven't even, I think, started. So some of the figures that you've provided there, they're really good starting points for us to understand actually how costly these sort of issues are, but they can never really capture the full extent of the harms and the cost of those harms to people.
No, it's huge. And, I think for me, the generational ripple effect is one that I worry about the most. I was bitten by a dog when I was a baby. So I've got a lovely big little dog mouth scar on my nose. It's very Ferengi.
But you can't see it all.
No, I know. You can if you're up close. I quite like it. It's very Star Trek like nose. Anyway, but I was never frightened of dogs, weirdly, even though that had happened. It was something obviously that I was due to do was step into this world of fixing this problem. But for so many, I know trainers and clients of mine and people that I meet in community, because I love talking to people about their perspective and perception of dogs. If someone has had a dog bite, it can have lasting consequences on them and their children, and they will be nervous around dogs, and then their children will be nervous around dogs, and that can make dogs more dangerous on its own, just because they're like, why are you being so suspicious and weird? And I do think there's that extra layer of just, dogs will have squabbles. We are very aggression averse in the UK. We don't like any drama. We really don't. Conflict is not something we do well in the UK at all. And either we do it online, or we watch our politicians do it in quite a catty way. But we really don't conflict well, like have conflict and then resolve that conflict well. So when our dogs have it, and sometimes that's very natural dog behavior for dogs to just get together in the park and say, "Get off me, that was rude. Who do you think you are?" We can have quite a reaction to that, right up to the edge of saying, I just want to avoid all dogs. And that again is terrifying for me, to think that people are just going to get to the point where they're like, let's just keep dogs and humans separate from each other completely and have so many controls that actually nobody interacts and nothing bad ever goes wrong. So I think there's a huge education piece there.
I agree. I think from what you're saying, there's two concerns that I have. One is that we, I think, increasingly expect our dogs to be robotic dogs, so that they're going to do what we tell them to do, that they're going to look a certain way, that they're going to behave a certain way. And in lots of ways, we want them to be able to do that without us putting much time and effort into it. So in a sense, we have this expectation that our dogs are going to just be these perfect, cute, loving, huggable things out in public in our personal spaces, without actually having a clear understanding of what their needs are, wants are, and that they are sentient creatures that have their own will.
Yeah.
any dog owner out there will know that their dog certainly has their own will. So that's one area concern in terms of people's expectations. So what they expect their dogs to be able to do with or without help from humans in terms of training. And then the other side is certainly the kind of, I think, concerns in society around, as you say, restricting more and more space to dogs. So in a sense, we need to protect people from dogs. And when we talk about the factors that are involved in dog bite instances, then obviously situational factors such as the proximity or accessibility of dogs to people, that is a thing that is important to consider. But that should not mean that we start to then put those physical and, if you like, emotional barriers in place, so that dogs don't get to interact with each other and that they don't get to interact with other humans. And I think it would be such a sad development in society if we ended up with the dog owners and the non-dog owners, like almost, pitted against each other, fighting for space, fighting for kind of experiencing their neighborhoods and communities in a pleasurable way. I mean, ideally, what we want is everyone to work together in that space to have a pleasant, enjoyable engagement across the board. And that takes everybody to take responsibility in that environment. So I think they're the kind of two areas in terms of expectations that we have of dogs. And then secondly, how we share that kind of shared space. I mean, again, we could talk about private space because we know a lot of dog bites happen there. But if we think about people who don't have dogs and how they are engaging with dogs and increasingly fearfully engaging, then I think we really need to be careful about those two aspects.
We did a recent meeting and we sort of broke down the areas where people might need to think about responsible dog ownership as being inside the house, their responsibility to their dog, inside the house, their responsibility to their guests and their family, and then outside the house, their responsibility to their dog, and again, outside the house, their responsibility to the wider community. And I think I like that. It's a simple, like 4 boxes. Like, am I checking that my dog is okay at home and outside? And am I checking that the public and my guests are okay at home and outside? It is a hugely complicated area. And so many people have been looking at this for a while. As you mentioned, the post office, the postal workers have been getting bitten for a long time. And some of that is just us managing our dogs and understanding that, hey, guess what? If you open the door to your dog, if you open the door with your dog, they're much more likely to bite somebody than if they're in another room. That's not going to happen because they're in another room, regardless of how they feel about the postman. It is fascinating. So what for you, there's so much detail I'd love to get into here, Jenny, in your study. You looked at some main places, didn't you? Can you tell us just the names of the places that you did specifically study in more depth when you were looking at sort of different licensing models and control models?
So from the 114 specific locations that we were able to review, we then did 5 mini case studies, and we tried to find a variety of approaches. So those that had, for example, bans, those that had restrictions, those that used licensing, those that didn't, and so on and so forth. So we tried to get a variety, and we also tried to get those who had some sort of evaluation done on their process. As I said, this is not something that is easy accessible, and not many places do. But essentially, we looked at Ireland, and we looked at Australia, and we looked at the US, and we looked at Austria and Canada. And within those locations, we looked at Calgary in Canada, Vienna in Austria, Monmouth County in the US, and Victoria in Australia. So there are the specific locations that we looked at.
Amazing. And what did you find when there were two that sort of stuck out a little bit more than others, wasn't it? I think it was Vienna and Calgary had very similar sorts of, so they had education and training opportunities that were mandatory in those particular areas. Like, tell us what you found when you looked at those sort of five, the top line learnings that you got from each of those places, would you say?
Well, so the type of things that jumped out at me were the different ways in which people kind of evaluated or identified dangerousness and responsible dog ownership. So, kind of classically referred to the ban here on certain breeds as the breed, not deed approach versus the deed, not breed. And you could see that, for example, in Calgary and Monmouth County, that they had more of a deed, not breed. So they weren't specifically interested in the breeds, that they were much more focused on the behaviours of the dogs and trying to identify problematic behaviours and tailor the response to those. Whereas if you looked at Ireland, Vienna and Victoria, then you could definitely see that was a combination of both. So they were focused on certain breeds in different ways, but they also were interested in the deeds. So again, there was a variety of approaches there. I think Vienna was interesting in that all dogs must be chipped and registered on a database in Vienna. You must pay a tax. You also need to get third-party insurance. So that's a requirement for all owners. But if you have a breed of dog that is identified as particularly or problematically dangerous, then you also are required to engage in learning for a license. So you need to complete a course then to receive that license. And interestingly, if you fail to complete the course, so if you've tried it a number of times and you fail, then essentially your dog could be taken from you or you're not allowed to have a dog. So they very much view the owners who are responsible for dogs that they identify as being potentially more dangerous as having a higher responsibility and needing to have kind of further kind of regulation put on them. But also they will take into consideration there if someone has a criminal record and as to whether that means that they should be responsible for a dog. So I think there's you can see there in Vienna, they are taking the deed approach, the breed approach, but they're also very much focused on the owner themselves. And within that, they have obviously the educational course that's compulsory for some owners. So that's an interesting approach, I think. If you consider then, let me see where else. Calgary's the obvious other kind of, I suppose, example of an approach that's doing something very different. All dogs are required to be licensed in Calgary, and it's pretty much seen as if you like, a public good or a social good. So that's kind of how they kind of phrase it there. So everybody who sees or perceives themselves to be a good dog owner will have a license. It starts at around $42, which is the annual license. But like other places, you can have a lower license, for example, if you have a dog that's for rescue, or if you've neutered your dog, then it can be a bit lower. You also may have a higher license if you have a dog that has been identified as a nuisance or a vicious type of breed. So in a sense, what we would consider a dangerous dog. So that's not based on breed, it's based on the behavior of the dog.
Okay. How do they collect that data out of interest, Jenny? Just to jump in there, like what's the pathway that they collect that kind of information from? Did you look at that? I don't know.
So in terms of how do they manage the system of licensing, or how they know what's happening with regard to?
Yeah, about the dog's behaviour. So if they is that like via councils? Like who is saying actually that dog was a bit dangerous, or is there somebody that would report a dog for its behaviour?
Okay, yes. So you can certainly report a dog. They also have bylaw officers, they call them peace officers in Calgary. And their job, so there's 90 of those for the city. Their job is to go around and deal with dog and other nuisance or community-related harms. So in the past, they had ones that were specific for dog-related issues, but now they have a kind of generalist approach. So those officers would have a role in the community of being able to identify these sort of issues, but then they also have a database where they record these issues. And so in Calgary, they've two databases. They've got the the licensing database, which records all the dog owners. And then they also have the incidents database, which would record instances that, as I said, are dog bites, strikes, but also dog-on-dog attacks.
Yep.
So they kind of collect a large kind of variety of data on those. People can report these incidents. The bylaw officers will record these incidents. And you can have there's a lot of multi-agency work there. So
Amazing.
You have that interaction between different agencies as well to make sure that as many of these instances as possible are recorded. So they have quite, as reliable as this data can be, they have quite reliable data with regard to these dog bite strikes and instances that are happening. And the records suggest that they are seeing a reduction in dog bites. And this is at a time when Calgary has experienced similar changes in the dog population and nature of dog ownership as we have here in the UK. So they've seen a rise, obviously, as we have. So we've gone from around 9 million to 13 million dogs in a very short period of time. They've seen a rise in the dog population. They have also seen a large number of dogs then relinquished during periods of economic difficulty. So, the pattern of if you like, socioeconomic factors that will influence dog ownership, that's also been fairly similar to what we're experiencing in the UK. It's also worth noting that because Calgary is beside some other localities that ban specific breeds like pit bulls, and they have a higher population. So I think the 27th most popular dog that's registered in Calgary is a pit bull. So again,
if you get a pit bull, you move to Calgary. That's what I'm hearing.
Exactly.
And we can all just be okay here. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, pretty much. And speaking with my various interviewees, they did point that out that people will choose a location based on actually whether the legislation allows them to have their dog with them or not, which in some ways sounds very sad. But in other ways, at least if you have a dog of that type, you can go to a safe location for them.
Really important for the data again, though, right? Because I think one of the main criticisms of the Calgary approach that I've come across in the past is that, the highest incidence is pit bulls. But actually, if there are more pit bulls, then that would make sense, wouldn't it, Jenny?
Well, exactly.
And the fact that in mind,
that they're seeing, a rise in the dog population, but at the same time seeing a reduction in the dog bites, that says a lot. And their dog bite data, it does include breed in there, but what they more so focus on is the categorization of the dog. So, for example, are they herding, hound, non-sporting, sporting?
Yeah.
So they have categories. So rather than focusing on breed, they will put them into categories that have some sense to them.
Yeah.
And
drivers.
Then you're not kind of caught exactly. You're not caught up with just a particular breed. You're caught up with the kind of the job the dog is being given or the reason why they've been bred, type of thing. And I think that can help make sense of the data in terms of you might expect a toy dog to have different circumstances in which it's engaging in some problematic behavior than a sporting dog or a hound, and so on and so forth. So I think the way that they can collect and also then categorize their data can be more helpful in, I suppose, taking the focus away from it's a breed thing and putting it towards, there might be characteristics of certain breeds that will influence certain kind of negative interactions, but that's not where we should be focusing our attention.
No.
And it is interesting, both Calgary and Monmouth County, that the breed issue, that really isn't something that they kind of focus on at all. And it's something that they try actively not to focus on. So Calgary, I think it was in 2020, did a review of their bylaw, and I think they had something like 100,000 responses. So it's one of the, as you know, I'm sure people in Parliament will say the same. When there's dog-related issues, they get a hell of a lot of responses from the community.
Yeah.
But within this, there was obviously the question about breed-specific legislation was put on the table, as you would expect. And while there were perspectives from both sides, ultimately there was a very clear, no, this is not something that we want in our locality. So I think these sorts of kind of I think it's just really interesting that when you look at the approach that Calgary has taken, it's not just an approach that's been taken by the agencies involved in regulating dog and human behaviour. It actually seems to be a community-wide approach. So something that has a lot of buy-in from the people there.
And everybody's different and every culture is different. And I think for the UK to adopt anything, the heart of justice is strong in the UK, and fairness. I think there's something about that in when we looking at laws and the treatment of people and the treatment of animals. Fairness is really like high up there. I think that's going to be super important for us to bear in mind. I know I was talking at the London Pet Show Live recently, and one of the comments from one of the contributors was, for goodness sake, there are some dogs that if they jump up, their paws are over your shoulder. And I was like, yeah, but that's so many dogs that we've had for so long. Like, how many dog breeds would you just completely get rid of if that was our category? It was like how big the dog was, and that's what makes it dangerous. I'm like, I really do think we're going to need something in the UK that is fair and that looks at like a reasonable understanding of risk. And actually, I think we've got a lot better data systems than we used to have now to be able to more fairly categorize that level of risk. That was the big issue with the XL bully. People like, but it's a big dog, can do a lot of damage. I'm like, that's true. So can a Newfoundland. So can Beethoven dog. My brain has gone. St. Bernard. Exactly. Yeah. They're beautiful and they have the capacity, right? So, but do they have the drive? And that's what then people go, oh, and this is where they get into breed and all of that. It's a really complicated area, but I think there is some solid foundations now for us to be able to better judge, I suppose, circumstances. And as you say, it's people. We're the ones who are always managing the lead. We're always the common denominator. It's actually, what do we need to know to be able to be managing our dogs, no matter what they are, in public?
I think when you mention fairness, one of the things that jumps out again with regard to Calgary and Monmouth County is how they approach instances where dogs have shown aggression or have injured or harmed a person. And one of the things that they take into consideration is the mitigating circumstances for the dog. So they review the actual situation and they look at a tailored response to that dog. So essentially, I know you've raised it before, that the Dunbar scale, which is actually used quite extensively across America and Canada, where it focuses on the behavior of the dog and the severity of the injury. And by combining those two things together, then you have a level of risk that dog has posed or is likely to pose to society. So they take that kind of approach, but when an incident occurs, then the dog is assessed by an accredited dog behaviorist. And the outcome is tailored to not just the dog, but the owner. And that means, for example, that they might be given some subsidized training sessions. They might have to carry out 10 more training sessions with a dog behaviorist. The dog might have to be muzzled in public, and they might have to have some kind of restriction put in place in the home environment and so on and so forth. But the key thing is that their first step, and this is even in instances where dogs have been involved in serious kind of attacks and therefore have injured someone very significantly, their first step is not, let's euthanize that dog. It's very much looking at the situation, looking at the circumstances, and then looking at what would need to be put in place to prevent that dog from hurting anyone else, but giving it a quality of life, because that's the welfare aspect. We can't just think about humans in this. We have to think about the dog themselves. And I think that approach, where it's much more measured, much more balanced and fair, as you're pointing out, because we know from anecdotal and from the evidence from research that when dogs are biting or engaging in instances that are harming people, often the human interaction can have a part to play. And that's not blame whatsoever. It's just simply, we don't necessarily understand dogs, or we think we do. We don't necessarily read them the way that we would be helpful for both the dogs and ourselves to have that level of understanding and engagement. But that's not necessarily where we are at. And therefore, we need to understand that when we're assessing a dog to see if it's going to be problematic in the future.
Absolutely. And that echoes, exactly. We've had Dr. Helen Howell on this podcast talking about how you can improve the assessment protocol for dogs and actually put so many more of those measures in to be able to keep a dog, not for the sake of keeping a dog, but actually, again, for fairness and for, there's lots that could be done to improve how risky this dog is in this particular person's hands. And it's, again, very often to do with the owner and this specific person. How risky is this dog in this situation? That really needs to be taken into account. So that's really cool that that's been recognised elsewhere. And you mentioned there actually a really lovely phrase. There's two phrases that I saw in your research. I wonder if you could just break open for us that I thought were really lovely. One of them was in relation to Calgary. And it says, in Calgary, the findings suggest high compliance rates that are attributed to a culture of care. I wonder if you could pop that open for us. And the other one was the one welfare approach. What do those things mean, Jenny?
So I'll start with one welfare, because that I think is kind of an easy-ish one to explain, because I think most of us are now familiar with the One Health approach. So that idea that we need to be considering health across a number of spectrums. So we need to think of environment. We need to think of the kind of our health system. We need to be thinking about our kind of food, our education. All those things come together when we think about health. And if we only address one and not the others, then essentially we're either missing an opportunity or we're not going to have the response that we're hoping we will have. So one welfare fits with that. So if we're thinking about the welfare of people, so if we're wanting to protect people, we also need to be thinking about the welfare of the dogs in this instance, or other animals. And likewise, the welfare of the community or society. So the one welfare approach is taking all that into consideration. And to do that, you need multi-agency responses. You need to have kind of consideration of the different aspects that kind of contribute to that One Health or one welfare approach. So if you're going to specifically talk about dogs, then that would mean thinking about where we're sourcing our dogs. Where are they coming from? How are they being bred? How are we acquiring our dogs? What's involved in that process? What are the potential harms along the way? Then thinking about when our dogs are living with us. What does that look like? What is a healthy environment for a dog? We know we get, so like the RSPCA gets so many calls about animal abuse. And within that, often dogs are the ones that are kind of high up in terms of the species that are being abused. So we need to consider what impact that is happening on our dog population, and so on and so forth. So you take all those different areas in which welfare come into play, and then you think about that in relation to people as well. So dogs and people, there's many ways in which their interactions with one another will impact their welfare. So whether it's zoonotic diseases, so the transfer of viruses or diseases from person to dog or vice versa. When you think of abusive, so one of my main areas of research, and I could go on about it for a very long time, is with regard to that intersection between animal abuse and interpersonal violence.
Uh-huh.
And that's quite extensive in terms of the areas in which they overlap. So that's kind of the one welfare approach, that we have to look at that whole picture, and we have to involve various people and agencies to have a clear idea of what's happening, and then put a response that's going to be effective in place. And then the other one, which was the culture of care. Well, I think I could start out by talking about the 5 principles that underpin their bylaw. So that's to license and provide permanent identification for pets, so straightforward, spay and neuter pets, provide training, physical care, socialization, medical attention for companion pets. So their bylaw is instantly thinking about the welfare needs of the animals involved.
Amazing.
Not to let pets become a threat or nuisance in the community. So you can see that they have a consideration in terms of the community and not just necessarily thinking about owners of dogs, but the community in which these dogs are in. And to procure their pets ethically and from a credible source. So that kind of underpins what they're looking at there is public education, enforcement and licensing. So they take that kind of 3-pronged approach. And that includes engagement with the community in lots of interesting ways. So, for example, they have, trying to think what they call them again, community like ambassadors. So people can register to be an ambassador, and they will just simply be walking through dog parks and so on and so forth, and they might see someone who's having trouble with their dog, and they'll go over and talk to them about it and offer them some kind of signposting to services or education materials or whatever. So you've got that, if you like, that idea that the community are part of the solution and part of the process. Also, when it comes to assessing dangerous dogs, when they're assessed, if it needs to, it can go to a tribunal, where if the owner is unhappy with the assessment, then the tribunal is a collection of professionals. So it's not a judge, it's like professionals, veterinary, behaviourists, lots of different people in the community who would be part of that tribunal to assess that particular incident and that circumstance, which again, there's that idea of fairness and that idea of that everyone is involved, everyone should be involved in these kind of decisions, because you are talking about a sentient creature, but you're also talking about public protection, which is key here. So so there's all these ways in which it's like it is a caring community approach rather than targeting owners or targeting problematic owners. That obviously is done as well. So within the Calgary approach, they also have fines in place, and these fines are significant, especially for repeat behaviours. So while they very much go for the carrot and stick. So the carrot approach, obviously lots of incentives to do good things and be good owners, lots of kind of incentives for community members to get involved and be part of the process. But then if that doesn't work, then they also have a pretty harsh approach to those who are transgressing the rules and regulations. And their aim was that 95% of people would be compliant with the licensing and through the community approach and so on and so forth. And then 5% would be through enforcement. So that's where the bylaw officers would need to step in and kind of stop people from engaging in negative ways. And this seems to be, so there seems to be a social consensus that when we live with dogs, we live at risk. So they seem to accept. And I mean, I had a light bulb moment when I was doing the research. I was speaking to one dog walker who was a very experienced dog walker, had a business in Calgary. And we were talking about why people are compliant, because that's one of the points you mentioned as one of the criticisms of licensing, is that if the good people, the good dog owners, as we like to kind of call them, are compliant and license their dogs, and then the bad ones don't, type of thing, that means that we don't have a system that's effective or going to work. And Calgary's known for having high compliance. So when I was doing my research, it had dropped a little bit, and they were very transparent about why that was. But essentially, we were talking about why is it that people in Calgary tend to be so compliant. And the fact that they live with much more dangerous creatures than dogs seems to be a feature. So, for example, the reason why a lot of people would keep their dogs on the lead is because either A, they're trying to save their dogs from coyotes, kind of that will roam in around the kind of city areas, or if they're in more rural areas, if your dog is free and it kind of encounters a bear and the bear attacks it, socially people will be very kind of, I suppose, very critical of you as an owner, because you've now endangered wildlife and you've endangered your dog. So I think the fact that they live with these dangers as an everyday feature, going hiking, they have to deal with a kind of potential of a bear attack, and therefore they have the right things in place to prevent those things from happening. I think that has a huge impact on their ability to deal with risk in the community from dogs. So that's why they're willing to. So again, I can't prove this whatsoever, but in speaking with the people, it became like, so, clearly people are thinking leads are good because we're protecting our dogs, rather than leads are bad because it's restricting my dog. They're thinking that every time you go out into the forest, we need to take precautions because there's a risk there. So they're used to that mindset. And therefore, when they are assessing dogs that are potentially at risk to the community, they're, again, putting preventions in place that they think are reasonable and appropriate, rather than kind of simply saying we can't take these risks. So I think the mindset is different for that reason. I thought that for me was a light bulb moment, thinking, how do we translate that to the UK?
I do think you might see a little bit of that in the way that the XL bullies have been, so many dogs have been registered that aren't XL bullies. First of all, the government were expecting 5,000 and 50,000 dogs registered to the system when that came out. And I really do think that was people saying, I want to be safe. I want to keep my dog safe. I want to show that I am a responsible dog owner of a big, thick-headed dog. And I wonder how much of that in Calgary is people just demonstrating, look, you've given us the freedom to have big and, dogs that in other places have been banned as a breed. And so we're going to demonstrate this exceptional level of care. And I just really love that as a sort of demonstration of freedom. I mean, it sounds to me like they have a fairly comprehensive and, and yet complex system of communication, of education, of legislation around the control of dogs. And how is it that is formed? How is that managed and funded, Jenny? How do they do that over there? Because for me, it feels like the UK have we've got very little boundaries, actually, and then hardcore legislation. It's kind of the worst kind of parenting, isn't it? It's like, it's fine. Don't do that, rather than measured boundaries and explanations of why things, that sort of grace approach of that culture of care. So how do Calgary afford it, and different places that you've studied as well? How is that affordable?
Well, so I think the reality is that when you talk about licensing, people's first consideration is, oh no, not another tax. I think with our current, I say current, but I think we've had economic difficulties for quite a while now, and I think most people would be kind of very unhappy if they thought they had to pay out some more money for something else. So I think generally the idea of licensing and having another cost in your household is seen very negatively. But I think if you understood what that licensing could do in terms of protecting you, your community, and your own dog, then you'd have a very, very different approach to this idea of licensing. And so I will tell you about Calgary in a moment, but it was just when you talked about finance, I know it's the elephant in the room. Nobody thinks that people will pay money towards a license because it's just another cost at the moment.
I'll tell you what, Jenny, just before you go there, I've been going around to lots of dog fests. I just talk to people. I love data. I love talking to people about their thoughts. And so I asked loads of dog owners what they thought. First of all, I asked them what responsible dog ownership was. And what it wasn't. So what do they consider to be irresponsible dog ownership? And then I asked them, if the government could do one thing to improve responsible dog ownership, what do you think that could be? And every single one of them said a licensing system. And I was like, wow. That's amazing. Like there was a lot of really, I mean, these were dog owners who were going to dog festivals, so arguably pretty into dogs. But that's great. Actually, there's I think a huge want for licensing if it comes with education. And I think that's the key. Old school licensing in the UK, you go to the post office, you'd buy, what was it, 30p or 12p or something crazy. It wasn't even in our normal money. It was in totally different money. So it didn't do anything, did it? So
no. And the thing is, licensing can be so much more than that. So I'll talk to you about that now in a moment in terms of what Calgary does and how it's really value for money. But I think before I talk about that, one thing that, again, you can't escape from is we know by looking at the increase in our dog population, I know from looking at the puppy trade that people have and do pay large sums of money for their dogs.
Yeah.
We know from the various companies out there selling dog products that there's been a huge increase in the revenue generated from dog foods and other products that we have for our pets. So it's not the issue that people can't or won't spend money on their dogs. I think they just need to consider the license as a valuable service and product, and that then therefore makes it something that they're willing to pay. So the kind of things that I suppose the buy-in for licensing comes from, for example, I think it's very affordable. So the license fee, $42. I think if you've multiple dogs, then it can get a slight reduction. I'd say if you're doing what we would consider responsible, although there's obviously debates on that, responsible dog ownership, like neutering your pet, for example, or getting from a rescue, that license fee goes down. They also have the capacity to have kind of, I suppose, lesser fees for those who are seen as more vulnerable or maybe are socioeconomically not as viable as other people in terms of being able to spend money on their dogs. So in that way, they're trying to tailor it as much as possible for people to come on board. Then the accessibility is a key thing. So the fact that you can just go online and you can purchase it online nowadays. Like, as you said, in the past, you'd go to the post office and that was a bit of a hassle. Nowadays, it's 3 clicks.
Yep.
And the system, so the interface for the user is really important here. You want to make it as simple as possible. You want to make sure that people, in some countries, you can do multiple years, so you don't have to do it 1 year at a time. So that's something you can do in Calgary as well. So like we know nowadays with IT, we know with people's engagement online that the easier it is for people to engage, the more likely people will actually comply and do what they need to do. Also, along with having your license, you can get cheaper neutering, you can get discount rates. So they have companies and businesses that will provide discounted products and services. And that information, so when you have a database of all the dog owners out there, or most of them, then actually you can use it as a really helpful communication tool.
Yep.
So if you have some new regulations coming out, if you've got some educational material, if you've got, whatever the story is, that can be communicated in our wonderful world of the internet very easily to owners. They also have this free ride home scheme, which they've a hilarious poster kind of linked to this of the dog's hair in the wind in a car kind of heading home. If a dog is found roaming, then they have an amazing database that almost always will link it up to the owner, and that dog gets driven home. So the owner's contacted and they get a free ride home.
Wow.
Which again removes so many of the stresses and strains on the dog from being put into a kennel environment. It removes the costs of doing so. And so on and so forth. So
That's
they have
amazing.
that.
And just on that, Jenny, do they must have a better microchipping system than we do then, because that must mean that they'd need a microchip that you could scan with, I don't know, like a mobile phone or just a better system, because ours are quite clunky. The numbers a whole microchipping system needs an overhaul. We've all said it for a long time. We need one centralized database for microchips because there are so many companies. All of the microchip numbers are too long and crazy. And create administrative holes when people just get one digit wrong on forms and things like that. So how do they do that? Do you know?
Well, they have their licensing system will have, it's worth noting that the system they have in place is kind of heads and shoulders above what we would have ourselves in terms of being able to connect the owner and the dog together and have the information on both of those at hand, in addition to the information on dog related incidents. But they've had a huge influx of funding to provide a bespoke database that will bring both of those data systems together. So they'll have the information on the dog and the owner, and they'll have the instance together. And the dog and owner database, so the licensing database, will even have facial recognition technology. So
Amazing.
That's for the dog.
Amazing.
So the officer can scan, go up to if they don't have a microchip or whatever, the officer will be able to scan that little dog's face, and then they should be able to identify the dog from that, even if it hadn't got a microchip or if there's any issues there. It's going to hold much more granulated data about the dog and the owner. And I was given examples when I was speaking to the various experts and professionals in Calgary about an incident that happened where someone spotted, say, a black Labrador, and it was out of control and had, kind of jumped on someone and scared them. And a bylaw officer comes along and they get the details of the dog. They don't have the registration, or they don't have the microchip number, but they have the details of the dog, and they had details of the owner, looked about 35. They were able to go into their system, put in that data, and the system brought up, well, these are all the dogs that are black Labradors in this area with owners of this kind of age.
Wow.
And from that, they were able to trace the dog. So it is incredible. And their system is only going to get better. So the next system that they're putting in place, it is bespoke, and it's going to free up officers' time. So again, you're talking about finances here. It is an injection, quite a significant injection to make something like this happen. But then you're freeing up the officers' time to actually engage in community kind of engagement, in education, and those other really important things that we know are going to help people to be more responsible dog owners.
Absolutely.
And the license fee essentially pays for this. So the license fee will pay for the. They also have what they call it, the City Animal Services Centre. And they deal with the licensing, they deal with kind of the rehoming of stray dogs, neuter subsidies, and all these sort of things. It completely pays for that service, and it pays for part of the bylaw officers. So because the bylaw officers are generalists, it actually pays for part of their role, and it pays for this animal service centre. So all that is paid for by licensing. So people know that not only are they looking after their own pet, but they're also actually helping to rehome and look after and neuter and give medical attention to all those other dogs out there. And we know in the UK, for example, that people donate a lot to animal charities. They really do care. So licensing could be seen as that. It's another way of me donating to that wider kind of society. And
because
making sure that
they're dealing with the fallout anyway, aren't they, of all of the decisions that we're making that are slightly irresponsible. It makes sense for a portion of that to go straight back into those charities.
So all that kind of comes together in a way where I think ultimately the people in society, most of them, because not everyone complies, even in Calgary, and, they did see a drop in the rate of compliance, and they very much identified that as being part of, the socioeconomic downturn, the pressures that people were feeling as a result of that. But ultimately, they have, if we got anything close to that sort of consensus and agreement and buy-in, then I think we'd be absolutely delighted. Because with that kind of buy-in, you can actually do substantial things. You can really move towards thinking about education, thinking about how to improve the welfare of kind of all the animals and all the kind of dogs that are in our community, and improve the lot of our community. So making sure that the spaces are for them as well as for dog owners, and that there are the right facilities in place to share that space in a kind of comfortable way. So their licensing does amazing things, and that's why it's not just a tax or just another cost.
Yeah. So it feels like you're a fan, Jenny, of the Calgary Wildlife. Would that be fair to say? In all the research of all the things that you've looked at, would you say that Calgary is like a strong place for us to start? Obviously, we'd never just drag and drop something, but do you think that is a plausible system for the UK to use?
So there are certainly flaws with their approach, and again, the people I spoke to were very candid about this. So yes, I think that if you take the kind of underlying intentions of their approach, and if you take the idea of lots of different tools in your toolbox that you can use, and if you take the idea of how to get buy-in from the community, real buy-in from the community, if you take those sort of approaches, then yes, absolutely, Calgary is a brilliant example to look at. I think a lot of what they do is fairly easily transferable to the UK context. But again, as I said, there are certain kind of social and geographic features that kind of, for me, may make me think that it's, you can literally just take from A and put it into B. The carrot and stick approach is very important as well. So while you have all that nice kind of happy outcomes from the licensing, you also have then the enforcement. Enforcement can actually is funded. So you will have the enforcement approach. So there's no point in having these laws in place. As a criminologist, certainty, severity, this is a really important thing. If people don't feel they're going to get caught and they don't feel the punishment is going to be problematic, then they're not going to really comply. So we need to make sure that the enforcement aspect is very clearly in place and that people will get caught, and as a result they will get serious penalties. And in Calgary that approach is certainly in place. So as I said, you have these kind of community ambassadors, you have the bylaw officers, and you also have, like, a lot of the parks will have a park community group. That's like, again, it's not the city that are creating these are people in communities, like a community watch type of thing. And then you have very significant fines if you're found to be kind of irresponsible dog owners. So I think those things combined
super important, aren't they? And you know what, that feeds into the same system again. This is why I've always said the DVLA is like the easiest comparison that I've always said to a solution, to have a centralized organization that has the data systems in place to be able to recognize dogs and owners and celebrate those who are doing well and communicate to them regularly, and then also obviously say, you called your dog 6 times and it jumped up at a kid, and so we're going to let you know that that's not okay, and that's something that you either need to get some extra training on, do a training course, or pay a fine. I think that it's not unreasonable, and it's the kind of thing that the UK would actually welcome from a lot of the conversations that I've had with people. So that's absolutely fascinating. And again, over time, if we're successful, fines should be going down because people are going, I don't want to behave that way, like that's not something I'm into, and accidents can happen, of course they can, and there's a lot of grace, especially when it is communities that are going, let's love this person well and give them some time to practice, and that puppy needs to be trained on a long lead, and they've been involved in that conversation, and we all need that space to kind of make some mistakes, don't we? But it is that perpetuation of the mindset of I don't care. I remember having a client once who literally, as I was training her dog had a poo, and I was like, okay, and I gave her a poo bag, and she was like, you joking? And I was like, oh no, we're going to pick that up. And she was like, oh, and so she picked up a dog poo, and then halfway through the consult the dog had another poo, and I gave her another poo bag, and she was like, this is ridiculous. I was like, it's actually the law, babe. Did you know that? Get really badly fined. She was just incredulous. Like, what? You are in the center of Birmingham. This is not like in the middle of it's never not okay. It's never okay to not pick up your dog poo, but particularly in the middle of a city. She was just like, no, I don't ascribe to this condition. It's crazy. So yeah.
But these small things are so important to me. I'll stick my little criminologist hat on, and there's a theory, broken windows theory, that we apply to situational crime prevention or preventing crime in the community. And the idea that if you demonstrate that you don't care about the small things, then it's very easy for bigger things to happen because people have that sense of in this place they don't care. And having dog poo on pathways and that, that is a sign to people that this is an area that doesn't really care too much. And therefore, maybe they don't mind the dog being off the lead in a way that's inappropriate. Maybe then they don't mind. So, it is about thinking about those smaller things that actually can have big impacts to people in the community. If you're not a dog owner, you're stepping dog poo. It's not something that you're going to take lightly.
Or littering, isn't it? Like places that you just see lots of litter in. You're like, oh, it's a shame this community doesn't seem to care as much about itself as others do. Yeah.
So I think that has to be part of the approach. It's not just focusing on the hard end of the extremely serious and risky behaviours. It's also what can we do about that softer end that will make life more pleasant for everybody involved, but also actually might have a huge impact down the line of preventing those hard end kind of instances from happening. So definitely kind of worth considering those, even if they're kind of seen to be less important.
Absolutely fascinating. Jenny, oh my gosh, this research, as I say, people have been waiting for this for a long time, and we're really, really so grateful for you and all of the team, because I know it wasn't just you. There's lots of people who get involved with research like this. I don't know if there's anybody you want to shout out to, Jenny, as a thank you right now for this research and more.
Well, obviously to the RSPCA, because they funded this and they had the kind of insight to think forward and bring this into play. And I know that they're developing this further now. So that's absolutely amazing. And without that kind of funding in place, essentially this research will not be done because it is hard to get funding for animal related issues in social science research.
Absolutely.
I've got some great colleagues who've worked with me along the way. So obviously thank you to those for their support along the way of the project. I think it's worth mentioning this was always set out as a small scale, almost pilot project in terms of the funding and resources available to it. There's so much more that can and hopefully will be done with this. It's only kind of pointing us in the right direction. And I'm hoping lots of other researchers and people out there are going to take this on board and see what they can do with it. See if they can look at other areas that are doing other things that might be useful tools for the UK toolbox. So, shout out to all those people who've been involved in the research. I had amazing support and help from people from in Canada, so academic researchers in Canada, but also the city themselves. They were very transparent, very keen to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And these kind of candid conversations absolutely have to be had if we're going to have a true idea of what works and what doesn't work and what the potential for the future is. So, without their candid and very open and eager discussions with me, then again, we wouldn't have this insight into what works and what doesn't necessarily work in their approach. So I think that's all the people. Obviously, thank you to you, Hannah, for having me on board
absolutely
having
my pleasure.
Research.
It's fascinating, as I say, and all research, it just helps us to improve the future of dogs. That's it. I'm always going to timestamp these things, but we are, in 2025 to 26, and hopefully there'll be people who are listening back to this podcast going, "Oh, this was the time before licensing." Perhaps, you never know. They might be living in a very different world. And looking back on this as a piece of history. So it's absolutely fascinating, groundbreaking, I would say, research. But I hear you, Jenny, it was a small research project and there could be so much more. What would you love if you were going to pitch 3 more research projects that could come off of this research project? What would you love to see them invest in looking at next, do you think?
3. I get 3 rather than 1. That's wonderful. Well, I think the follow-on research that the RSPCA are doing, I think that's really important in terms of understanding the public appetite for licensing and what that should look like for them. So what would a good licensing scheme look like to them, and what incentives and added benefits can we bring to that kind of approach? So I think that's really important because, as I said, without buy-in, it's not going to work. Yep. Research on dangerous dogs, dog-related incidences. There's so much you could do there. And we just simply don't have the data to make sense of that. So I would say, obviously research that brings, it kind of finds a way to better collect that data would be important, but also evaluating responses. So that's one of the things I wanted to look at what works in terms of reducing dog bites.
Yep.
I found some really interesting research that was pointing to potential responses that would work, but very, very little in terms of evaluating any of those responses. So people out there are doing amazing things. They've got great ideas. They're putting them into practice, but evaluating if it works, how it works, and why it works is really important. So absolutely. And if we do that, then we can, provide this evidence to people to say, look, we can show you exactly what's happening now. You need to give us money to make it happen for more people type of thing. So I think that's missing. And I mean, generally, as said, my research area is interested in animal abuse and the intersection with interpersonal violence. And that's a whole area that is so kind of under-researched and so little is understood. So we constantly make these kind of connections, but then we don't have a full understanding of them because we just don't have the research there. So that's an area that I will absolutely be driving forward. I've kind of been researching animal sexual assault and kind of interactions or intersection with interpersonal violence and so on and so forth.
There was a recent AppDog meeting about that, wasn't there? I think there were two. I think it's become a bigger a topic that actually, if we start to look at animal abuse as a precursor to human, domestic violence and homicide, they're really closely linked, aren't they? And it's something that we definitely need to be looking at on the whole a lot more.
So absolutely we can be. I mean, the intersection is vast. We don't have time to go into, but I have a lovely PhD student who's going to be starting this year, Mayher, who's been already working very effectively, but now she's going to be doing a PhD on coercive control and the role of kind of pets in coercive control in domestic violence relationships.
Wow.
So people understand that this is a part of the puzzle. So when you're trying to address a domestic violence, you should also be looking at the pets in the household and that the interactions and the kind of engagements there. So again, this is the kind of research I'm very passionate about, because by helping animals, we're going to help ourselves in so many ways.
And you might say a licensing system would probably help with that too, because you would have a much better cohesive piece of technology that could track, interesting injuries that vets have come across and things like that. A place to be able to put that information would probably help the criminal cases that come across too. So, weirdly connected.
For sure. Weirdly connected. Absolutely. I mean, I often have debates with people like, tell me any area that doesn't involve some sort of engagement with animals that's not relevant to our lives. They fit in there. Often kind of we don't notice them, but they're there in lots of different ways and kind of an important part of the puzzle for us to be looking at. I think just before we finish off, I think it's worth noting or worth me saying that with any approach, so whatever might kind of happen here in the UK looking forward, it is important to think that any approach has the good aspects, but also the bad. And I think there are, again, things that I've seen in Calgary, Monaghan City, our county, and so on and so forth, where I would question whether that would be helpful in the UK context. So I think it's important that whenever we look at any approaches that are happening elsewhere, that we very much think about, are there potential negative connotations of adopting this approach in the UK? So it's, I suppose, one of those like warnings at the end of or at the side of a tin or something that while I've been very positive about lots of the things that are being done elsewhere, we also have to think about, are there any potential negative consequences for the animals themselves and for the people, the dog owners and so on and so forth, that we don't want to have in place in the UK. And the one that comes to mind is around restricting access to areas. So we kind of started the podcast talking about that to some degree. In Calgary, they have designated parks for dogs, and dogs can't be off lead anywhere except those parks, or when they're outside the city limits. Or
which
in their own public domain.
We don't want that in the UK. No way.
Exactly. And I mention that because I think that there would be a lack of transparency if I didn't say they have this great approach and they have these great results, but then they also have things that maybe we would find not particularly helpful for ourselves or for our dog population here in the UK. So whenever we look at dog licensing in the future for the UK, we have to be aware that those sort of things don't kind of creep in and become part of a licensing system, unless it's tailored and kind of works for particular communities in certain ways.
We don't want hyper-legalism. It's not what we want. We don't want legal. We want freedom. We want to be able to be expressing our freedom well. We are a big fan of that, aren't we, in the UK? Having freedom and demonstrating and using our freedom well, I think, is something that we're all going to want to champion. And whatever it takes for us to be able to, maintain freedom and increase it, arguably. In Spain, I know they have to wear a muzzle if their dog is over a certain weight category, but they also get to take their dog to the cinema, so you win some, you lose some.
In Spain, when their kind of new legislation, I say new, it's quite old at this point, but when I was looking at it, they did have a requirement that owners had to prove they were psychologically capable of owning a dog. And again, that could be, he was like,
how do we do that?
I'm not sure where that would go in terms of who's deciding if someone is or not, and what will go into that. But the idea, I think, is a nice one, where the fit for purpose and in the way we do a driving license to drive a car, do we need something that people demonstrate that they have a capacity, they have a basic understanding of a dog's needs, of a dog's behaviour. As you say, being able to read even the most kind of basic behaviours.
And recognise the dog's needs. I know I worked with a client who had special needs. This is a case study example. I was working with the parents, and they were bringing this young man into living on his own, which was lovely. And he had a dog with him. And the difficulty was, over those series of sessions that I did with him, I was like, my love, you're not filling up the water bowl. Like, we do need to be aware that the dog needs his water filling, So yes, we're taking him out on lovely walks, and you're always spending time with him, but it's those little things that you go, actually, is that a need that needs meeting, and feeding that back well. So yeah, it's really important.
It is, and I think that's why these discussions need to be had. Like, everyone needs to be able to have their say and bring their own bit that's vital to the pie, if you like. So it's really important that we hear the people who are using dogs as assistance dogs, or to provide them some kind of comfort or abilities in life. Postal workers, everybody needs to be able to have a say in terms of what a licensing system might look like in the future.
Absolutely.
Dog owners and non-dog owners. I think if we kind of manage to capture those different perspectives and views, then hopefully we'll find a way to put something in place that would be agreeable to those who have to pay these kind of license fees, because they see it as a public good, a social good, but also as something that is helping themselves and their loved ones, whether they're four-legged or two-legged.
Super. Jennifer Mayher, it's been so wonderful to hang out with you. Thank you for giving us so much of your precious time.
Likewise, Hannah, and I'd love to speak to you much longer about all the different clients that you've had along the way. I'm sure you've lots of insights that you could share with us.
Absolutely. But equally, that is all, as people often point out, Hannah, that is your subjective opinion. it's anecdotal evidence, and I'm like, it's true. It's pretty good still. I've trained 10,000 dogs in 10 years, so I've seen quite a lot of things. But it is wonderful to get some peer-reviewed science behind some of the policy decisions that we have just made quite a lot of knee-jerk decisions when it comes to managing dogs. And I think the future of dogs is that we stop doing that, and that we actually lean into the research and make some good decisions that are going to keep everybody safe for the future. So yeah, we will definitely catch up again, Jenny. I think there's lots of areas of research of yours that I find absolutely fascinating. And just on behalf of everybody at the Future of Dogs, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise. And if you want to find out more about this research and anything else that you do, Jenny, how would people find you in the world?
So they can find me always at the University of South Wales through my email address there. I'm on LinkedIn, but please don't ask me what my... Maybe I can provide you information afterwards. You can flash it up on the screen or something. And obviously for this report, as I said, it was funded by the RSPCA, and they're taking it further, carrying out further research. So Sam Gaines and RSPCA is also a key person to speak to about this, and how hopefully we can put something practical in place that it comes from the research.
Amazing. Yeah. And for more on that, don't forget you can check out the RSPCA's Take the Lead report, where they take some of this amazing science and digest it into a slightly smaller document. If you don't like reading the big ones, if you do like reading the big ones, just like me, and you're a big dog geek, then you can get Jennifer's research online too. So yeah, all from us, it's been such a pleasure hanging out with you, Jenny. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we just wish you luck on all the rest of the amazing criminology research that you do. And thank you for putting your brain to this task, because it's something that we're all very passionate about. So bless you. Take care.
Oh, thank you so much. Likewise. Thank you.
And that's all for another episode of The Future of Dogs. Big thanks to our sponsor, Amplified Behaviour. Your host and producer is Hannah Malloy. Technical direction, audio and video producer is Mark Goslett. And the graphic designer is James Whipps.